Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Stalked on a camping trip. When I was 20, my girlfriend at the time and I decided to take a week-long camping trip to some property that belonged to her father's friend. We were going to bring my Australian cattle dog Wrangler and her German Shepherd Zero. It was about a 4,000-acre undeveloped ranch in the northeast Texas woods, and the plan was to be taken by four-wheeler to a point on the property unknown by us, and then we would hike back to the main gate over the next week. I had a GPS unit for an emergency, but we planned on doing the trip with maps and compasses only. We were well equipped for the trip. We had enough food for 3 days and planned to hunt for the rest, water for 4 days and a water purifying system, all the necessary camping gear. My girlfriend also had her bolt-action .223 and a Taurus Judge, and I had my .22 rifle and a .40 cal Baby Eagle. We arrived at our destination and bid farewell to the friends that dropped us off on the four-wheelers. Our first day mainly we wandered around exploring and figuring out our plan. There was a creek running through the property that we thought we could follow, and it would get us pretty close to the gate. We had our plan and had done enough exploring, so we started setting up camp before dark. Our first night was very pleasant for the most part. Dinner by the fire with the dogs, chit-chatting all night till about midnight, and then we decided to turn in. I woke up around 2:30 with a strange feeling. I saw Wrangler and Zero at the door of the tent, very tense but not making any sounds. I knew right away something was up. Both of these dogs were well trained and very loyal and protective of us. I stepped out of the tent with a light and the .40 cal to look around and left the dogs with my girlfriend just in case. She didn't hear anything, she's a deep sleeper. I made my rounds around camp and found nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I passed it off as a pack of coyotes and went back to bed, trusting the dogs to watch out for us. We woke up the next morning, and I told her what had happened. We just blew it off and began our day. But the second night we set up camp near the creek, and things got a bit hairy. While sitting around the fire, we heard a very strange sound, something I've never heard before. The dogs began to growl and snarl, facing the woods north of us. We quickly drew arms and began to sweep the campsite. We found nothing, but the sound persisted all around camp. It was like a snarling, gargling, sniffing sound. We didn't sleep that night. No matter how much we looked and checked, we could never find the source of the sound, and the dogs were restless the entire night. By the third night, we were very restless too, and when night fell, we sat by the fire with arms at our sides. We were going to stay up in shifts to keep watch just in case. While I was asleep, I heard the dogs go off, and when I woke up I saw my girlfriend standing with Zero at her feet and her Judge drawn. I quickly took arms at her back. Something had apparently ran very rapidly behind our tent. She couldn't describe what it was, but then it ran by again. I caught a glance under the light of the fire behind us, and whatever it was big and very fast. It was running on all fours, but that's all I could tell. It sounded more like Creature 1 this time. They were coyotes. Too big and way too fast. Heather spotted it again behind the tent and fired. We heard a nasty snarl, and Wrangler broke away from me and gave chase. I love my dog, but didn't dare go after him. I just called and called, but he didn't return. We stood there, guns drawn, for about an hour after she had fired. Everything was quiet. And then we heard rustling. We had our sights on the sound, and Wrangler came out of the woods running. He wasn't hurt, but he had blood on his back. After this, we decided to bug out at sunrise. We packed up and started hiking. We were about 2 days hiked nonstop from the gate, and we were ready to just do it. The last night we didn't camp. We broke out the headlights and just kept going. Whatever was in those woods was back, following us, but at a greater distance this time. Whatever it was followed us all night, and that was one of the most intense hikes I've ever had. We hiked with our guns in front and the dogs in back, and whatever was following us wasn't stupid. It stuck to our sides, usually about 40 yards out into the woods, and always out of sight. We stopped to rest for a few minutes around 4 a.m., and they stopped too. From what we could hear, it sounded like maybe 3 things were out there. They got closer when we stopped, and I thought I saw something and fired the .223. I didn't hit anything. Probably my mind was just playing games with me, but the shot scared them back to a much greater distance. By sunrise, they were gone again, and we made it to the gate before dark, and then hightailed it out of there. We returned the next day on 4-wheelers, and several other people came with us to have a look around. We went to the site of our second camp and found a blood trail from whatever the hell Heather had hit with the slug shot loaded in her judge. The trail ran for about 200 yards before we lost it. We found nothing else and headed back before darkness caught us again. We never found out what was out there, and no one had any experiences like that on the property before. To this day, I try not to talk about it too much because I even have trouble believing it sometimes. I try telling myself that it just was coyotes with mange or mutated or something, but Heather never let me believe that. Not too many creatures out there can take a 410 slug and bleed that much without going down, especially not a yote. All I know is that I won't camp on that property anytime soon. The Woman at Fleeken. It was 1971, and I was in my late 20s. I was then living in Rose Hill, Mauritius, not married yet and staying with my parents. One day, my dad met a South African couple while he was coming home from work, and found out they were tourists visiting with their backpacks, tents, and sleeping bags. My dad was a very friendly guy, and invited them to stay over with us for a few days. I remember the guy had a big blonde beard. He was very kind, his wife as well, but I forgot her face. We decided to go camping during a weekend on the west coast of Mauritius, in a place called Fleeken. This place is pretty now developed, but at the time was very wild with just a few houses. We went on a Saturday morning, found a nice place to put a tent, and organized the day. The South African man and his wife were very good swimmers and divers, so we spent a lot of time in the sea, catching fish, crabs, some lobsters, and we cooked all these goodies on a small homemade barbecue set. All of us, Mom, Dad, the couple, and me, really enjoyed the day. The sunset was beautiful, it was warm, and everything was perfect. The night was starry, and my dad was happy and drunk, and the couple was obviously having a great time. Since we were not fluent in English, communication was a bit difficult, but we could still make ourselves understand with gestures and sometimes drawing in the sand. It was great fun seeing my dad trying to converse with them with a very limited knowledge of English. Anyway, it must have been around 9 p.m. when this happened. We were all seated on the beach, watching the ocean as well as the starry sky by the campfire. It was just beautiful. Then we started to hear a sound. We couldn't determine the origin of it, but it sounded like a woman wailing. It was faint but clear since the place we were was wild and remote and there was no one around. The wailing was not constant, but would be heard from time to time. We put it on the sound of maybe some animals in the bush. Since we were not people living on the coast, we were kind of ignorant of any animals which could be active at night out there. We were seated on the beach facing the ocean when suddenly we noticed something coming out of the water on our left, about 30 or 40 meters away. It looked like a woman with a long white dress, just walking from the water. We could not see her face, but we could see she had very long hair. She silently walked by us and disappeared from our view into the vegetation. We found this very odd. I knew this was not normal, but didn't know what the others were thinking. And again, my dad was drunk and was just watching the scene with a little smile on his face. I tried to check if there was a house where the woman walked to, so I stood up and walked towards the sea and looked on my left to see where she went. There was only green, just bushes and trees. There were no lights or any buildings around. I was now scared because I was realizing that maybe we had just seen a ghost. I walked back to the bonfire and sat down and told everybody that I did not find any houses there. We stopped talking and stayed alert. We could now hear all the little noises of the night. We heard faint crackling like someone or an animal quietly walking on dry leaves. Then suddenly we heard a loud flapping noise on a tree nearby. It looked like a bunch of large birds, maybe even pigeons or bats or whatever, I don't know. They were all flying away. It scared us. And then my mom told me quietly she felt that something was not right. She felt like we were being watched. The South African couple was looking around with their glasses in their hands. Then suddenly, something heavy fell in front of us on the beach, about 5 or 6 meters away. I stood up to see what it was, but could not find anything. Everybody stood up and looked around. There was nothing there. Apart from my father, who was in a trip because he was too drunk, we were all scared. The couple talked between themselves, and I couldn't understand what they were saying, but they seemed quite concerned about the situation. I didn't know what to do. Should we stay there, or just go to sleep, or maybe we should leave? Which would be a pity, because we were enjoying such a nice time before seeing that woman. Later on in the night, we heard this bone-chilling scream like a woman being attacked, and it seemed very close to our camp. We were on our feet with eyes about to pop out from their sockets, and my heart was pounding so loud that I thought the others would hear it. The couple started to pick up their stuff, and my dad followed them. Mom and I packed everything away quickly, too. As we were doing so, some coconuts fell and rolled out into our camp, as if someone had thrown them. We were now scared to death, and no one would talk. We heard running on the beach and then in the woods, but couldn't see anything. We couldn't see anything. We loaded up the car, and it was not easy because we didn't have a big car, and when we had come out here, we had taken the time to pack things so that they could actually fit. Now we were just piling up things, and the worst was the barbecue. It was still hot and dirty, and we didn't want to leave it. I remember burning myself more than once while trying to put it away. While we were packing up, things were happening around us. The screams seemed to originate from different places, and there were a lot of other noises too that were really irritating. We all jumped into the car, practically upon one another with all the stuff all around us. I decided to take the wheel because my dad was too drunk to drive. As we moved away, we got a shock. We saw a woman dressed in white standing by the little lane, just staring at us. I'm not kidding, it was bone-chilling. I stopped the car. She was standing about 4 or 5 meters away, and I didn't know what to do. I was too scared to move closer to her, but I knew it was the only way out back to the main road. We waited a few minutes as she just stood there staring at us. I heard my mom praying, and the South African couple mumbling something between them. And then we heard a huge bang like something had hit the car from behind. We all turned to see what had happened, and again, the atmosphere was very tense, and I think my dad was becoming sober very quickly. He was now swearing. We didn't see anything behind us, but when I looked forward, the woman was not there anymore. But then, the scariest thing happened. She was now standing right outside my door looking at me. I can't describe the utter fear which had taken a hold of me right then. I screamed, and my throat was sore for several days after. I just jammed on the gas pedal, and I think everybody screamed then. The car bucked forward, and the woman was still there looking at us. I remember not seeing her eyes or features because it was so dark. I drove off as fast as I could, and the poor car got shaken on the dirt road. We reached the main road relieved and shouting, "What the hell had we just seen?" Fortunately, Rose Hill is not far from Fleeken, because when we reached the town, the car broke down, and we were lucky that we were in town. The fan belt of the car had broken, and the engine stopped from overheating. This was in the 70s, so no cell phones or any towing services available on a Saturday night/Sunday morning. The couple and my mom walked home, which wasn't that far away, and my dad and I stayed by the car. Once she was home, Mom phoned a friend of my dad to help tow our car. We finally got home at around 11:30 the next day, completely exhausted. We invited my dad's buddy to have coffee, and we told him what had happened. He told us that that place in Fleeken was haunted, and several people encountered that woman. He said that we were lucky because there were accounts of people walking to the sea in a trance and never coming back out. Basically, they drowned by possession. My dad's friend said that these events did not always happen, but they happened frequently enough that people talked about them. The South African couple stayed a couple of more days at home with us, and then they left. We never saw or heard from them afterwards. Can't blame them. I later discovered that there was a cemetery on the little road that led from the main road down to the beach. I never figured out who that woman or ghost or whatever it was, but I did know that she would come out of the ocean and walk to the cemetery regularly. That's what the stories say. However, in the late 80s, she never came back and no one's reported a sighting of her. There have been no accounts of seeing her up to this day. I think that the urban development has made it, or her, change her walking plans every night. A Chance Meeting with Gizmo and Friend by Pandora's Bottle. An old guiding buddy of mine told me this story, and while I wasn't there myself, this happy-go-lucky, hyper fella got real pale and quiet while telling it. He would only tell it to me in the daytime, after weeks of badgering, and it was the only time I saw him scared in all the months we spent leading groups around Appalachia. I've been meaning to write this one down for a long while, so I'm going to tell it as close and as well as I can. He calls it the Gizmo story. Bear in mind, the names have been edited. I'm going to call my buddy Mark. Mark went camping in a state forest in Virginia with a group of his college friends. They were a small group of 4 from the outdoor rec department, experienced kids with all the necessary gear and in familiar terrain. Being college kids, however, they rolled into the campsite fairly late and decided to just car camp. It's camping near the car, no hike to a separate location. It was early evening, but still before sun had set at least. As they were unloading the car and setting up camp, 2 mangy fellas came out of the woods and approached them. These guys looked like they'd been living out there for quite some time, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but they acted very odd. They wouldn't look you in the eye and seemed really twitchy, just kind of hanging around like they wanted something, like coyotes. My buddy Mark, he got the gitchy feeling right away. The guys introduced themselves. Now, nobody I've spoken to can remember the first man's name. It was something unremarkable like Bill or Rick. But the second guy, he said his name was Gizmo. Funny name, hard to forget. So Gizmo and his friend started asking questions. Questions like, "Y'all fixin' to stay the night? How much food you got? When are you kids supposed to head home? Y'all got phones on you? Any more y'all planning on showing up?" Well, Mark didn't like that one bit, so he started telling tales. "Yeah, there's going to be 8 or 10 more of us showing up tonight. Our parents expect us home first thing tomorrow morning. And they're super paranoid, so we got to get home on time or they'll call the cops. Parents, am I right? That sort of thing." Gizmo and company poked around camp a bit more, then wished the group good luck and disappeared back into the woods. Mark and his friends joked nervously about Gizmo and his friend, but weren't worried enough to actually leave. They built a fire and cooked dinner, and cleaned up and hung up the bear bag. They spent the rest of the evening hanging out around the fire, chatting and drinking. By midnight, they had all turned in. They had brought 2 tents, a girl's and a boy's. Well, Mark didn't feel right sleeping in the tent. He felt like somebody needed to keep watch, so he lay down by the fire. Sometime later, Mark found himself awake. The fire was dying when he opened his eyes, and he couldn't see much beyond the campsite, except for one bright burning spot. There was a light out in the woods. It bobbed along at chest height, occasionally disappearing behind the trees, sometimes pausing. Whoever it was at a good distance, maybe 100 yards out. When he told me the story, the distance was between here and that tree, so I can't be certain. He followed it for a while until it went out. He stared at the darkness for a long time until he eventually fell asleep once more. Suddenly, Mark woke up again, this time in a panic. The fire was down to embers, barely glowing. He opened his eyes to see that strange light in the forest was back, and it was much closer now. He could see that it was from a lantern, and he watched as the lantern carved a smooth perimeter around the campsite, occasionally going out, but always reappearing a short distance away. Mark pretended to roll on his back and sleep so he could watch. It circled the campsite twice, getting closer each time. The strange thing is that there were no sticks breaking, no leaves crunching. Somebody traipsing around in the dark woods that close should have made a lot more noise. Whoever it was trying to be real quiet. Mark lay there, tense and unmoving. By the time it began its 3rd rotation of the campsite, the lantern was so close that Mark could see a face illuminated in it. It looked like one of the guys from earlier. He couldn't remember which one. His eyes were bugged out, scanning the campsite like a predator. and he was sweating. Then the lantern went out. At this point, Mark woke up. He got up and started making lots of noise, stoking the fire and packing his gear. His watch read that it was 4:30 or so, and the sun wasn't up yet. He considered all that had happened and made the tough call to wake up his buddies and bug out. Nobody argued when they saw his face. Like I said, this guy is happy-go-lucky, a human golden retriever, and an experienced woodsman to boot. You'd believe him too if you saw his face. The sun was barely starting to come up by the time they got in the car. As they were driving out, they passed something they hadn't noticed on the way in. It was an old RV parked out in the woods, camouflaged with a mixture of earth-colored tarps and actual greenery. It was surrounded by a chain-link fence, which was also draped with camo tarps and leafy boughs. The whole thing looked like a long-term hunting campsite. Mark and his friends were actually relieved. Gizmo and his friend might have been poachers, and that would explain their creepy stalking behavior. They had been trying to scare the kids away from the hunting site, Scooby-Doo style. Still cautious, they hightailed it out of there and counted their lucky stars that they weren't deer. And that should have been the end of the story. This next part I don't understand. I don't know why Mark or his friends didn't tell anybody about Gizmo for a few weeks. I would have thought for sure he'd report poachers ASAP. He's very type A, and it's not typical for him to procrastinate or let a rule go unenforced. I don't know what his excuse was, but Gizmo and his pal were forgotten. Then one day, Mark mentions the incident to a law enforcement officer from the Department of Natural Resources that came and lectured at one of his classes. She asks casual questions at first, just being polite, but then stiffens at the mention of the name Gizmo. "By any chance, do you remember the other guy's name?" she asked. "No, it was something normal, I don't remember." "God," she replied, "they always say that." Turns out that a part of this woman's job was investigating the murders that occur in Virginia state forests. Most are body dumps for crimes that occurred elsewhere, but over the last decade, a series of unsolved cases stretching all the way into West Virginia had targeted what appeared to be random, unrelated campers. But when they interviewed others camping in the area around the time of the murders, they all mentioned the same uncanny detail. They had all been approached by an individual named Gizmo and another man, whose name no one can ever seem to remember. The Forest Witches by Railoto. I went camping in Big Sur, California with one of my best friends. It was off-season and a Sunday night, so the place was practically empty. We picked a campsite about a half-mile walk to the ocean. It was in a huge open field surrounded by a lush forest, and in the background were the limestone mountains. You could hear the crashing of the ocean's waves. Pretty epic. We spent the night around a campfire telling stories and eating. We were both pretty experienced backpackers, and were very diligent in ensuring we do not leave a trace of food by our site, and almost everything other than our essentials goes in the bear bag. I had my dog with me too. She was ADA, so she was allowed on the site. She was leashed around one of the trees in the field, on a long metal leash in a full harness. It was a full moon, and it was pouring beautiful blue light across the field. I can't tell you, it was absolutely pristine and breathtaking. Around 1 a.m., something spooked my dog. Now, she's used to the woods and has an incredibly calm demeanor, but I mean she was flipping out and tugging hard on the leash like she was desperate to escape. And she did. She pulled so hard that her harness snapped, and she went bolting across the field into the wilderness. I lost my cool, and I dropped everything and bolted after her. I'm not thinking straight running into the woods at night, but my only concern was getting her even if it meant risking my own safety. I did rescue her. I found her curled up in a random clearing in the woods, looking ashamed and terrified. Thank God she ran in a straight line, otherwise I would have been totally lost. I walked back to camp carrying her, and my heart was pounding furiously at the horror of the idea of her being lost in the wilderness forever. Even thinking about it now is still unbearable. I could feel her heart pounding in my arms. She was terrified. Well, I was no longer in a great mood. We all decided to head to bed in my tent, but my dog wouldn't lay down. She refused. Her ears were up, and she was staring intently at the tent wall, as if she could see through it, and she was tracking something. It took a while for my nerves to calm down before my chase earlier, so I was working hard at taking deep breaths and reminding myself that I'm prepared for anything that I could encounter. that my dog is simply spooked from maybe a raccoon or something she saw out there. And I thought maybe she's just exhausted and acting up. But then I heard it. Cackling. Like a high-pitched laughter that is full of a disgusting type of joy, and it's coming from outside my tent. And fuck deep breathing. My senses went on high alert, and my body tensed up so tightly it was like I was about to break in half. Honestly, I couldn't even breathe. And then I heard even more cackling, like a group of witches were doing something evil just yards away from our campsite. It filled my hearing, laughing and laughing and more laughing. It's loud and it's just so wrong. I couldn't even bring myself to move to look up at my friend. It was like my entire body had given up. And then the laughs were followed up with blood-curdling screams. I mean, it honestly sounded like somebody was being murdered. Just this noise that was full of panic and horror and sadness. Jesus, dear God. It could have been wolves or coyotes killing their prey, I suppose, but it sounded so distinctly human. The laughter, the sobbing, the screams. Finally, my friend said something like, "What? What the fuck?" I found myself starting to laugh a little because the situation was so intense and wild, I really didn't know how else to react. "I can't handle this shit," I said, and I suggested we bolt for the car. It was a mile away, so we decided to stay out. We just sat there listening to the laughter and screaming until it faded away. Even when it was over, I didn't bother going to sleep. Bicentennial Nightmare by Wheelhorse Lover. When I and my wife were quite a bit younger, we decided that we would spend the bicentennial outdoors. Yeah, July of '76. We're old. We lived in Pueblo at the time and decided to go hiking, fishing, and camp along Lime Creek between Durango and Silverton. There wasn't anything other than brookies in the creek, but they were plentiful and fun to catch. We left our car by the side of the road along Old Lime Creek Road about 5 miles in from the highway and packed in upstream along the creek with our shepherd, Rebel. It only took us about an hour to get where we wanted to camp. A nice meadow beside the creek, just before a slot canyon that required you to swim to get any further upstream. It was either that, or take a several-mile detour. We camped uneventfully that night, the 3rd of July, enjoying the sounds of the rippling creek and nature all around us. It was such a nice night that we just slept out under the stars, and didn't bother to pitch our little backpacking tent. A little cool, but we had the fire going in our lightweight 30-degree bags, so we were pretty comfortable. The next day we had breakfast, packed up, and we all swam our way up the creek to the next wide spot with a bit of bank in the canyon, only about 150 yards or so. Now, Rebel was never one to turn down a chance to get wet, but we had to do quite a bit of coaxing to get him to follow us up the creek. We fished and splashed upstream a bit, and before we knew it, it was lunchtime. We thought we'd fry up some of those brookies, but we were in the slot canyon that terminated in a fairly deep pool with about a 10-foot rocky waterfall at the end of it. We decided that I would scale the waterfall and pull the dog and the packs up, and then I'd help Maggie get up. It was fairly difficult, even with the help of an old cable left over from a mining operation that was hanging down the side of the wall of the canyon. It took a lot of effort, and though we finally made it, we looked back down that waterfall and wondered what the heck we were thinking. Rebel was none too happy about it either. It seemed to get more irritable by the minute. We found enough driftwood at the rocky top of the falls to get a fire started, and got the fish fried up. But that was about it. You know the uneasy feeling that you always get with stories like this? It was like a switch turned on, and we all of a sudden became aware of our surroundings. It grew like a cancer, and I actually watched the hair on the back of Rebel's neck stand up. Maggie felt it too, and we both noticed that it was getting dark fast down in this canyon. First thought in my head was a cat, and I actually felt a bit better about that because I figured a cat would leave us be, between the fire and the dog. I told Maggie what I thought, and she seemed to feel a bit better too. I did not want to get caught in the dark in the canyon, for a bunch of reasons, flash floods, etc. I spied what looked like a mine shaft about 200 feet above us, a heck of a steep climb, but it looked like our best bet. We pulled out our flashlights, and by the time we reached it, it was pitch black. The dog was a mess by this point, whipping around in circles, whining, yelping, and generally being a pain in the ass. Maggie and I were drenched with sweat and immediately began to freeze. July in the mountains is a weird thing. I've seen blizzard conditions before, but this was like someone turned on the deep freeze. We were at what looked like the start of a mine. It only went back about 10 feet, but there was evidence of fires at the mouth, and they curiously looked fresh. I was too tired to think more about it. I knew we had to get out of our wet clothes, pitch the tent, and climb in our bags before we got serious hypothermia. That was no fun, let me tell you, having to do all of that by the light of our rapidly dying flashlights, and there was no firewood anywhere close. I cursed myself several times for letting things get this far out of control. We finally got the tent pitched right there in the back of this little cave, buck naked as we had no dry clothes left. The sleeping bags were slightly damp too, even though we had stuffed them in plastic garbage bags before our swimming expedition up the canyon. We froze. It was miserable. About 1 a.m, I called Rebel into the tent for a little heat. The dog seemed to have calmed down greatly, and with the added heat we drifted off. Sometime during the night I heard something that just about woke me. I was still in a haze, so I fell asleep again immediately. I woke up another time because I thought I heard Rebel yip a little bit, but again I was in and out. I put my hand out to pet his head, and he licked my hand. I fell asleep again. Maggie later said she fell asleep the same time I did, but never woke up at all during the night. I woke up to the most horrible noise I have ever heard come out of a 100-pound woman. Just the most god-awful shrieks that I have ever heard. I never want to hear that again. I opened my eyes just in time to see a man at the mouth of the shaft, silhouetted against the morning daylight, looking back at us with the most twisted, evil grin I have ever seen on the face of another human. I scrambled to get free of my tightly zipped bag in the little tent while he just crouched there and grinned. When I was just about free, he disappeared. Now, we were granola-crunching, tree-hugging, anti-gun nature freaks at the time, so the only thing I had of any consequence as a weapon was my camp knife. I found it after what seemed like hours of searching, but was really probably under a minute. I very cautiously made my way to the entrance, millimeters at a time. The guy was gone. About that time, Maggie started screaming and whimpering again, so I rushed back to the back of the shaft. She had struggled out of the tent and was pointing at what used to be Rebel. His head was nearly severed, and the tent and the bags were ruined with all the blood all over everything. She had blood all over her, so the first thing I did was make sure she was not injured. Then I checked myself. We were okay. It was all Rebel's blood. We put on our still damp cold clothes from the night before, and then we noticed that our boots were gone. We were in trouble. I had some paracord, so we tied some shirts and towels around our feet and climbed back down towards the creek. We left everything in the mine, except for the knife and some stuff that we shoved in our pockets. It took us 8 hours to get back down to the car, and we were like hamburger. Hands, feet, arms and legs scraped raw, bruised and bleeding. When we jumped in, the car started right up, thankfully, and we left a dust cloud that blanketed the valley as we sped down the rough trail toward Durango. We limped into the sheriff's office, and we looked like hell. We got our story out, my wife through tears and me talking way too fast, but finally got it all out. The deputy said that they would go out first thing in the morning and asked us to stay in town. We had no money for a hotel, so he let us stay in a cell after we showered and changed into prison jumpsuits. We were there at the jail waiting when the expedition returned with the convoy of 3 trucks. I noticed that all the officers, who were quite wet and filthy, gave us dirty looks as they passed us, and the deputy that we had talked to the day before herded us back to his office. Then came the interrogation. It turns out that some animal had spread the dog's remains all down the side of the creek, and he said that there was nothing else there. No tent, no backpacks, nothing. He asked us if we had any drugs. I did not want to admit to him that we had some herb, so I denied it. It was clear that we were fighting a losing battle. They had come to the conclusion that we were wandering out in the woods high on LSD while a mountain lion had gotten our dog. The bastard even made us change back into our filthy clothes and give the jumpsuits back right then. He told us that he had better never see us again. And we left. Maggie was sobbing. I have never been back to Durango. the thing that I still have nightmares about years later, and I have never mentioned this to Maggie, is the second time I woke up when I heard Rebel yelp. Was that when his throat was cut? And if it was it the dog who had licked my hand before I fell back asleep? I still go out in the wilderness, never overnight, out well before dark. Only with other people, and always with a gun. I respect animals, but I fear people. Ghost Dog Got Me Straight by Whistle. This was maybe 7-8 years ago when I was 20, and really in a bad way. I've been fucking up my life via heroin for the past year, but after lots of help, love, and luck from friends and family, I was finally getting my head cleared. Almost there, above the black tar hell I'd gotten myself into. I decided to get out of the city and drive 2 hours out to a smaller town in Missouri, where Google Maps told me a small campsite by water was. I knew there wouldn't be many campers, because it had just started to get cold out, and the nights were about 40 degrees or so. Nearly there, as I'm driving down a misty morning road, just a picturesque straight 2-lane highway, there's this object laying in the road about a half-mile up. I slow my approach, and can see it's this shaggy mutt, just hanging out. I stopped and rolled down my window right next to it. She came up, licked my hand, and wagged her tail a bit. She had no tag, no tattoo for a chip, I later checked. She was just a dog with no name. Naturally, I popped open the passenger side door for her, and she was glad to hop in. So, now I got this dirty but friendly companion for my little excursion. The dog with no name. The entrance to the campsite was only a half-mile further, and as I suspected, there was no one around. I dropped a 5 in the honor box and picked the site closest to the stream. I set up my tent, the same one I'd set up for years with my dad as a kid. I collected some wood and started a fire. The dog with no name just circled the campsite, looking content enough to sniff some leaves and roll around in the mud. I went to check out the rivulet. It was about 30 feet wide and had a man-made stone dam you could walk across. To the west was the deeper part of the river, sort of pooling at the dam, and maybe an 8-foot drop to the east into calmer streams. Instantly, I wanted to go in, cleanse myself, symbolize, baptize, whatever. I grew up Catholic, so that kind of shit runs through my head to this day, though I'm far from religious. The dog watched me scoping it out the whole time from the campsite. I couldn't bring myself to do it, though, and I was hugely disappointed in myself. But it was cold, the water was brackish, and I didn't have a towel. So, I went back to the campsite to smoke cigarettes, eat hot dogs, and pet the dog with no name. Night falls quickly after all this meditation, and I roll inside the tent to sleep. My buddy sleeps inside the tent right next to me. This dog was fucking awesome if you couldn't tell that yet. I woke up for no reason I can put my finger on, and my main source of warmth, the dog with no name, was missing. I slide out of the tent, and I guess I had left it unzipped. But there she was, just sitting, waiting for me in pitch black, wagging her tail. I felt really strange, like something was happening there, and someone or something was telling me to get back down to the river and do the damn thing I wanted to do. We walked down the short trail together, surrounded by the blackness of a Missouri night. It was even colder than before, but I started to strip anyway, standing on the chilly stones of the dam. The dog with no name sat on the edge of the river again, just watching me, a slight wag. I'm now stark naked, staring into this black pool that looks like some kind of supernatural ink. And I should mention here that I hate swimming in water I can't see the bottom of. My imagination takes over and I freak out. In other words, I stand naked on the dam for over 10 minutes, before I finally muster up the balls, albeit shriveled and tiny at this point, say fuck it and dive into the blackness. It was cold as hell. I mean, it was scary as fuck, too. When I came up for air, I was thrashing wildly backwards towards the dam. Scrambling back onto the slick stones, I shook out my hair and was surprised how the adrenaline helped in keeping me warm. As I picked up my clothes and shoes, I looked over for my buddy at the river's edge. The dog with no name was nowhere in sight. Back at the campsite, I'm looking around, gently whistling, that kind of thing. I'm more than woken up now, so I go ahead and start another fire. Dawn is just starting to break. I have another hot dog for breakfast and figure I might as well just pack up and leave. The trip felt more than complete. As I started my car up and checked my phone, there was an hour time difference between the two. And this happened to fall on daylight savings time. I'm not calling it a supernatural rip in time, but it is funny that the night this went down, in fact, the exact time would be around 3 to 4 a.m. that the dog disappeared. So, the dog with no name never showed up, and I never shot up heroin again. P.S. I realized the dog was probably from a nearby farm and found her way home, but the coincidences were wild enough for me, and my mind needed all that at that time. The Manitou Islands, submitted by Dan McGee. There is a small group of islands in Lake Nipissing, Ontario, Canada, called the Manitou Islands. They are really pretty, and about 10 kilometers or so out from North Bay, Ontario. They are uninhabited, but people boat out them to hang out on the beaches and check out the variety of birds and such. Overnight camping is not really allowed, but when I was in my early 20s, some friends and I decided to do it anyway. They are supposed to be haunted, and people say the biggest island, which is called Manitou Island, actually speaks to people when they paddle or stay by there. Really, it's an eerie effect of the wind blowing through some volcanic tubes that actually form the islands. At any rate, we, that is, Teddy, Matt, Christine, Julie, and myself, wanted to check it out. We loaded up 2 canoes with our camping stuff and shoved off from Nipissing Beach, which is about 10 kilometers south. We figured no one would pay attention if we left from there and not from North Bay. Don't ask, it was just the way we thought at the time. This was in August, around 2005, and I remember the weather was really nice. We planned on staying overnight, and if things were cool and no one said anything to us, we would stay the whole weekend. Off we went, and it took us about 2 hours or so to get to the islands. Matt actually got there before the rest of us, as he had a kayak and was a lot faster. There was another family that was just leaving, and we talked with them for a while. I jokingly asked if anything spooky had happened, and they just laughed. They took off, and we pulled our canoes and kayak further up on the beach. We figured we would camp there, as the sandy side of the island is on the far side away from North Bay. If we had a fire, no one would see it from the mainland. It was about 4 in the afternoon when we poked around for wood, and Teddy accidentally stepped into some poison ivy, and we all laughed at him as he washed his leg and then dumped a ton of calamine lotion on it. Dumbass. It was warm enough that we were just going to sleep on the beach in our bivy bags and blankets, but we brought tents just in case. After swimming around in the shallow water and just having fun, Matt and I got to work on digging a pit for the fire, and the girls started to break out some food. Oh, yeah, and the Molsons were flowing by this time. Matt and I were talking about the legends that people say the islands are cursed, and Julie was getting scared. The stories talk about the hardships that the Nipissing tribe had living in that area, and that the raiding Iroquois tribe helped to decimate their numbers. Some tales talk about how some of them tried to make it a go on the group of islands, and others talk about the failures of others hundreds of years later. I'm not sure if any of it's true, but I've also heard about a failed mining project as well as a hotel night spot failure. The mining thing actually is true. We saw the foundations there. But the other stuff, I don't know. It was getting on in the day, and we got a nice fire going and made hot dogs and beans for a supper. And we're really just happy being out there with our little group. We kept sipping on beers, and Matt broke out stuff for s'mores, and the fire was just the perfect atmosphere. We watched the sun set on the lake and got back to talking about the islands. Teddy actually wanted to borrow Matt's kayak and go over to Calder Island for some reason. It was only like a half-kilometer away, but it was dark and Matt said no way. Teddy got irritated, and he was a little drunk and started going off. And that's when we heard it. This low moan seemed like it surrounded us. I immediately thought of the caves and how the wind worked, but this wasn't like that at all. This was right next to us. It happened so fast and went away we laughed uneasily and just decided to blow it off. A few beers later, and now in total Canadian darkness save for the fire flames dancing around us, Christine said she needed to pee, and Julie said she would go with her into the brush. Matt and I yelled about poison ivy and then started laughing about how awful it would be to get that on your balls or your lady house, and even Teddy started to lighten up. This developed into even more gross jokes, and soon we were spitting out beer and laughing uncontrollably. And then we heard Julie scream, and Christine right after. We jumped up and saw them race out of the brush towards us, Julie practically jumping onto me. "What's up? Why are you screaming?" asked Matt. "There's someone out there," Julie basically screamed. I told her it was okay and that she needed to relax. "Who's out there? What are you talking about?" I asked. Christine jumped in and said that while they were taking care of business, they heard voices talking in a language they didn't recognize. It wasn't English and it wasn't French, and they were sure of that. They just said the voices were low and didn't sound friendly. "Oh hell, I'll go see," said Teddy. Matt reminded him about his poison ivy, and Teddy just said, "Yeah, well, what else can happen? My leg is already beat." He grabbed a flashlight and headed off into the dark. Seriously, you can look this place up on Google, and you'll see that the islands aren't that big. Where we were camped out maybe had 100 meters behind us to the other side of the island. It's possible someone else was out there, but that bothered me even more that somebody would want to mess with us. I grabbed another flashlight and headed after Teddy. Julie told me to stay, and I said it would be okay, and just put more wood on the fire. I yelled for Teddy, and he waited up. We went to the other side of the island and could see the lights of North Bay way in the distance. We then skirted the island in the water for a bit to avoid any poison ivy we might not see in the dark, but soon decided to head back to camp. When we got into the woods, I heard it. Soft voices whispering. I asked Teddy if he could hear them, and he said yeah. I asked him if we were just drunk, and he said no effing way. It sounded like the voices were coming from the tree branches above us, then behind us, then off to the sides. It was like we were surrounded. Without warning, a huge tree limb crashed to our left, and we booked it out of there back to camp. Another limb fell, and we just kept running. What was really messed up was the laughter. I kid no one, I heard something laughing. There's not a lot of anything other than birds on these islands, so this was freaky. Teddy and I burst back onto the beach, and Christine screamed again. Julie grabbed me, and I grabbed another Canadian and downed it in one shot. We told them what we heard, and the girls wanted to leave. Matt was cool about it, but in so many terms told them how stupid it would be to canoe in the dark back to the mainland, and that we should just settle down and ride things out. "Let's all just calm down and relax," said Matt, and I agreed with him. Teddy looked as white as a ghost and kept throwing more wood on the fire. It was blazing away, and honestly, it was comforting. I checked my phone for the time, and it was just about midnight. I figured the sun would be coming up in about 5.5 hours or so. If we stayed cool, we'd be able to leave at first light. The tension started to go away, and Matt and I tried joking with everyone again. Everybody eased up, and the girls and Teddy started to drift off. I grabbed a beer and threw one to Matt. We talked in low tones for a while before I noticed him staring at the far end of Great Manitou Island, to the southwest of our camp. I looked at him, and he jerked his chin in that direction. There was a light on the edge of the water and trees. Not a lantern or a flashlight, but a soft, cloud-like light, and it was slowly moving towards us. I looked to the other side of the cove, and there was a similar light on that side coming towards us too. That one was closer. "What are we going to do?" I whispered. He shook his head. We watched the things bob towards us, but before they got to the edge of the beach, they just disappeared. We looked at one another, but didn't say a word. He threw some more wood on the fire and said, "I get the feeling something or someone does not want us here, dude." I looked at my phone again, and just a few more hours and we could split. I wanted to go right then and there, but, like we said, boating at night in a big lake after more than just a couple of pops was a worse scenario than staying put. Just before dawn we heard the moaning again, and then a short bit later, some laughter. Teddy and the girls started rousing, and Matt got busy taking care of the fire. We quickly gathered up our stuff and loaded the canoes. After a fast brush down of the sand where we had stayed, you'd never even know that we were there. I did one more quick sweep of the area, and that's when I saw the footprints. Dozens of them, in all different shapes, all around the edge of our camp. They weren't there the day before. We certainly would have noticed them. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen until we got off the island, and we were halfway back to Nipissing Beach. There were a lot of "get the hell out of here's" and "you're just making that up." But I wasn't. I'll go back there any time, but I probably won't be staying overnight again. Maybe the legends are telling the truth, and that we're not welcome there. We can't say for certain what it was that we experienced, but I will tell you this, it was pretty scary to say the least. A Scary Camping Trip by Dr. Jim Danger. When I was about 18, me and some friends took a road trip about 7 hours or so down to the Apalachicola National Forest near Tallahassee, Florida. We were going to do a little car camping, drink a few ice-cold natty lights, 18-year-old stuff. As such, we didn't want to be bothered by any park rangers, so we drove way deep into the woods. We got there, set up camp, had said natty lights, and me and a guy decided to go do a little exploring. So we walked about 100 yards from our site back to the main road, and saw another path directly across from us and started walking. Immediately, we started seeing signs that someone had lived there for quite a while. Big bags of trash, stuff like that. Should have been a huge red flag to turn around, but 18. Nothing could hurt us. So we get to this campsite of an older white guy living out of his van. Clotheslines strung up, coolers placed around it, and a big, gorgeous dog, I think maybe a golden retriever. We tried to back out, but he saw us and started talking. He was friendly enough, asked us where we were from, told us about some cool spots to check out in the park, and we ended up chatting for about 10 minutes and then going on our way. I kept thinking to myself how odd it was that he gave directions in steps, not yards or miles. And the guy always seemed to be off balance. Not stumbling drunk, but like he was walking on a balance beam, swaying side to side. Oh, and he was super excited to talk about national parks and forests where we were from. Okay, camping part over. We went back to our tents, and fast forward 2 months, the same buddy called me late at night and told me to turn on the TV to the news. I obliged. I saw an old dude with a van. You see where this is headed, but I didn't at the time. So I get pissed at my friend for waking me up. And he says, "No, watch." And then I see the golden retriever, and it all clicks. What the fuck? That man's name was Gary Michael Hilton, convicted of at least 4 murders. He kidnapped and murdered a girl on Blood Mountain, Georgia, an older couple in Pisgah, North Carolina, and a girl in the Apalachicola at that campsite not long after we left. Yeah, the very same places he had all been talking to us about. Obviously, we called the cops. They put us in touch with the FBI, and we got flown down to take investigators to the campsite. We pointed out every spot we saw anything, told them exactly what he told us, and showed them the places he described to us. I didn't find out until after the trial, but apparently they found what appeared to be partially destroyed human finger bones in an area near the site. We had to fly down again to testify. Hiking the Pacific Coast Trail. The story occurred in the summer of 2008. I grew up in Oregon and was acquainted with the outdoors at an early age. My favorite hobby came to be hiking, particularly in areas that are either very dangerous or isolated. The health benefits of hiking were secondary to the thrills of walking the edges of exposed cliffs, being in cougar and bear territory, and knowing that I was far from help. Into the Wild was released in the fall of 2007, and I immediately fell in love. Being a high school senior, I could barely go another week living in my parents' house, and the movie spoke to my sense of adventure and inspired me to hike the California portion of the Pacific Crest Trail upon graduation. I made it from the Mexico border to Northern California without much incident. I saw rattlesnakes and black bears, experienced dehydration, but nothing happened that made me fear for my life. Somewhere in the Lassen National Forest in northeastern California, I walked around a bend in the trail only to be startled by 2 people sitting on a rock, dressed in nearly all white. Their faces were dirty, their appearance disheveled, and the man had a long, unkempt beard. Both seemed to be in their 40s. They looked like the couple who kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. And what struck me as odd about the encounter was encountering anybody at all. I frequently went days without seeing a single human being. Their white clothes could be explained away by the need to escape the California summer sun, and their scruffy appearance could be explained away by the fact that most thru-hikers abandon personal hygiene on the trail. After I said hello, they said nothing and simply watched me as I passed by. Even that I didn't find odd. I chalked it up to them being foreign and not knowing what to say, and I camped a few hundred yards off the trail that night as I always did. Following bear precautions, I hung my leftover food I had cooked that night from a tree approximately 5 feet off the ground. Packing up camp in the morning, I noticed the food wasn't there. I immediately thought a bear had entered my campsite, so I began to look for paw prints. I didn't find paw prints, but I did find boot prints circling the campsite. 2 pairs of boot prints. One of those set of prints led right up to the rope from which the food was hanging. I thought of the couple I had passed earlier, and everything clicked. I quickly packed up and left. My mind was racing the entire day, but I figured the couple was simply hungry. If they had nefarious intentions, they would have come for more than just the food. Several days passed, and my mind was at ease again. I had begun to circle my campsite with sticks to wake me in the event of an intruder, animal or otherwise. I awoke in my tent one night to the sound of those sticks crunching. I grabbed my hunting knife. I tried to relax by telling myself that in the middle of nowhere, the source of that noise is much more likely an animal than a person. Then I heard frantic whispering. It was impossible to tell which direction the voices were coming from. Being in the dark, surrounded by trees 100 miles from the nearest city, plays tricks on your senses. I debated yelling out, claiming to have a gun, but instead decided to be silent and retain the benefit of surprise. I heard footsteps circling my tent and was ready to slash whatever or whoever opened it. But just like that, it was over. No more footsteps, no more whispering. I lay frozen awake in my tent until sunrise and opened my tent to find nobody there. The only evidence something had actually happened were the boot prints, the same as before. Several more days passed and I was now in Shasta National Forest, probably 50 to 75 miles from where I first encountered the couple. The trail became more or less a goat trail, and being on the side of a mountain and above the tree line, I could see the trail winding for miles in front of and behind me. I stopped for water in the rare shade and noticed 2 hikers miles behind me. All I could see were 2 white dots moving along the mountainside. I immediately said out loud, "Fuck this. This trip is over." I pulled out my map and looked for the nearest town, which appeared to be Castella, located off I-5. The only problem was, that was 25 miles away. I hiked well into the night, trying to gain as much ground as possible. I kept losing the trail and decided to set up camp, this time far off the trail and into the forest. I got in my tent and tried to sleep, but every little noise kept me awake. After a few hours in my tent, I heard the telltale signs of another bad night. The footsteps, the whispering, the sticks breaking. Sound travels far in the absence of other sound. I knew they were close, but wasn't sure how close. And all I could think was, this is fucked up. This is so fucked up. God damn it! Finally, a flashlight hits my tent and lights up the entire thing, and then goes dark. I unzipped my tent and climbed out carrying my knife, yelling nonsense into the dark. It was sort of like that cliché scene in movies where people in the wilderness hear sticks breaking around them and the camera pans around the trees, because the people have no idea where the direction of the sound is coming from. Then I heard footsteps running towards the tent and barely made out a figure moving in my peripheral vision. I turned and ran deep into the forest. I tripped several times and ran into several trees. After running for approximately 5 minutes, I tripped, rolled, and came to rest next to a downed tree. I got under the tree trunk and laid still. I saw the flashlight moving around in the distance, and I laid under that tree for hours. I was certain they were gone, but I didn't move. Eventually, birds started chirping, and I knew sunrise would come soon. Once it did, I made my way back to the trail, abandoned my campsite, and walked the rest of the distance to Costello, where the Pacific Crest Trail crosses I-5. I hitchhiked my way to the town of Mount Shasta and spoke with the police and Forest Service. They put me up in a motel for the night, and my parents drove from Oregon to pick me up the next day. I followed up with the police and Forest Service months later, who told me there had been similar reports of items disappearing from campsites throughout the surrounding national forests. However, there had been no other reports of the terrorizing that I had experienced. As far as I know, nothing ever came of that couple. Labor Day Trouble. Just this past Labor Day weekend, we took our canoe down to Waldo Lake. 3 nights, 3 different campsites on the south end of the lake. At campsite number 2, we thought we had a ton of solitude, but at about 7 p.m., a rowboat, not a canoe or kayak, pulled up to the shoreline not 300 feet south of us. Now, when there's no other people within a half mile of your camp, 300 feet seems a tad close. But I figured, hey, as long as they're cool, I'm cool. But at about midnight, my wife woke me up. Hey, did you hear that? Hear what? The people camping over there are fighting. Fighting? What do you mean fighting? Sure enough, I could hear cussing and yelling and stuff being thrown around. Obviously, there was a lot of booze being consumed, and they weren't like that when they arrived. They would go silent for a minute, then start right back up again. They were far enough away that I couldn't quite make out what was being said, but then I clearly heard a female yell out, "I'm gonna fucking kill you!" Silence for a minute. Then a gunshot. We lay there in horror. Did we just hear someone get murdered? I mean, what should we do? What can we do? We're literally in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest road, in the pitch dark. And someone over there, not too far away, still has a gun. About 20 seconds of silence. More cussing and screaming. Evidently, it was a warning shot. At first light, we packed up camp, hopped in our canoe, and went down shore a good mile away from those drunks and their firearms. My Hiking Story by SPG. My girlfriend at the time and I were on a backpacking trip through northern Vermont. 10 days of hiking and camping in the great outdoors. We were carrying everything we needed for the entire trip, food, supplies, etc. And we weren't planning on leaving the trail at all. I've been doing outdoors stuff my entire life and feel very comfortable on trips like this. My girlfriend had done a decent amount of hiking and camping, but had never been on a trip this long. Honestly, I was totally psyched to have a girlfriend interested in this sort of thing. My previous girlfriends had been good for a day hike, but that was about it. Anyway, the woods, and more importantly, weather, were beautiful, and everything on our trip was going great. Our routine was pretty simple. We'd hike around 15 miles during the day, and when it started to get a bit dark, we'd hike off the trail into the woods a few hundred yards or so, and find a nice flat place to set up our tent for the night. It's always surprising to me how alone you can be out in the woods. The first few days, we saw maybe 3 or 4 other hikers each day, usually just walking by us in the opposite direction. By the 4th day, we had stopped seeing other hikers at all, and this is because we had hiked farther north by this point, into a more secluded area that gets a lot less foot traffic. So it's the 7th night, and we haven't seen anyone else for probably 3 or 4 days. I fell asleep and woke up very early, as I do while camping. Typically, I had just been lying in my sleeping bag waiting for my girlfriend to wake up. But while I was laying there, I heard a noise outside of our tent of something walking around. We were pretty close to the edge of a river or a lake, and I was excited thinking that I might get to see a moose. I got out of the tent as quietly as I could, and it was still dark out. The sun was not yet up. My eyes were used to the low light, so I scanned around for a moose or other animal, but didn't see anything. Eventually, I made something out, though, because of its movement. There was a man standing about 100 feet from where our tent was, and as I watched, he simply turned off and walked into the woods. You know that feeling you get on a roller coaster when everything drops out from under you? I had that exact same feeling out in the woods and had no idea what to do. A lot of possibilities were racing through my head. Was he a hunter or a random camper who just stumbled onto our tent? And if so, why was he out here so early in the morning? The sun wasn't even up yet. I checked my watch. It was 4 a.m. If he wasn't a hunter, were we unintentionally on his property? Was he pissed at us? Why didn't he say anything? I was having trouble coming up with explanations that made sense and weren't just completely terrifying. What was this guy's deal? I ended up getting my girlfriend up a lot earlier than normal, and we hiked lots of extra miles that day. I have no idea if that guy was following us or what, and I spent all day looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him every single time coming up from behind. Of course, nothing happened, and we finished out the trip safely. But the vision of this guy walking off into the shadowy woods is still completely etched into my mind years later. Rednecks in the Swamp, submitted by Terry Bozzio, fan 72. When I was about 25 in 2001, some friends and I wanted to go camping, but not at a campground or anything like that. We wanted to just be out where no one else was and hang out with some brews and a few fatties and do some fishing, etc. This happened in Louisiana, the Honey Island area, and no, this isn't about the supposed swamp monster because there is no such thing. And to be honest, this was scarier than any tale of skunk apes could possibly be. My friends Link, Brian, and Heath and I got together, and Heath's dad worked at a place on the Pearl River that was deserted on the weekends. We got permission to park our trucks at the business, and we were going to hoof it through some woods and go to a place on the bank of the river away from civilization. It wasn't in the middle of the swamp, more on the edge of it. The nearest town to the south was Slidell, but the Mississippi state line wasn't too far away either. We packed up a bunch of food, beer, our fishing gear, and of course, some herb. It was about 6:30 in the evening on a Friday night in July, and it was hotter than hell out and humid. We parked at the place and then started hauling out our stuff out along an old beat-up trail that led to a clearing on the river. Heath's dad told him that there was a skiff out there that a coworker left for people to use if they wanted to, and we could check that out too. It took us a bit to get out there as we were all dragging coolers on wheels with the food and stuff, but when we got there we immediately put up 2 tents and had some brews. We needed to get firewood before it got dark, and once we had enough for the night, I fired up a J and Link got a campfire going. We all sat around eating some sandwiches we brought, sucking on beer and slowly getting toasted. It was heaven. We had some Zeppelin playing on a CD player, and the night came down with us, just relaxing and shooting the shit. It was late when we decided to hit the sack, but we wanted to get up early and take the skiff out for some fishing, so we didn't really party that hard on that first night. Some people might say we were crazy for camping out there with the snakes and bears and such, but to be honest, I rarely saw anything like that. I mean, I had seen them, but they never really bother you if you don't mess with them. Heath and I were sharing a tent, and I think it's important at this point to mention that Heath is black. Our families had been friends since before we were born, and we still all are today. We were best men in each other's weddings, and Link was part of the party too when we got married later on in life. To this day, I'd do anything for these two men and their families. But unfortunately, not everyone around our town thought the same way, despite it being the 2000s. Link was up before us and had checked out the skiff. There was a motor on it, and a big can of gas was in a wooden box next to it, so we were set there. We ate some breakfast, and then grabbed one cooler and filled it with beer and water and snacks and stuff, and then got our gear in the skiff for a day of fishing. The Pearl is a tricky river sometimes, and the currents take a bit of getting used to, and the fishing is the same. But there's good bass and crappie fishing out there, so we put our bets on getting some dinner. It was cloudier than the day before and not as hot, and a little breeze kept things cool even though it was Louisiana in July. The day went on as we caught a bunch of panfish and meandered around the river having a great time. We drank a bunch of beer, but kept pace with water as was our rule. We liked to party, but we always kept it sensible out in the woods. I hear and read so many stories online and on your channel about people that are just friggin' stupid with their drunken antics, and then they wonder why they get into trouble. Okay, I'm off my soapbox. It was getting late, and we needed to get back to camp. And we had stopped at one point on a little island, and Link had left his hat there and didn't remember until we were all the way back at camp. He wanted to go get it, but Heath convinced him to get some food first, and then we'd go back, or maybe even just wait until the next day. I cleaned up the fish, we cooked them over the fire, and we had a couple of beers, but before I broke out more herb, Link insisted we go back and get his hat. It was getting dark, but Heath said okay, and maybe it'd be cool if we saw some of the nighttime animals out doing their thing. We grabbed our shotguns and flashlights, hopped back in the boat, and set off for a nighttime adventure. Alright, I know I'm rambling, but this is where shit goes south. We got back to the island, and the swamp is doing its thing in the night. Lots of turtles were out, we could hear all kinds of birds and critters moving around, and we got to the island, and Link just grabbed his hat and looked off down the river at something. I asked him what was up, and he said, "There's a big fire over there. Can't you see the light it's kicking up?" We both looked, and yep, around a bend in the river, we could see a bright orange light cutting through the dark. Link wanted to check it out, and we said cool, why not? But we drifted down without using the motor so we wouldn't startle anyone there, and actually not let anybody know we were coming. We got closer to the fire and paddled to the far side of the river to see what was up. It's a good thing we did. The fire was coming from two burning crosses. There were about 15 or so guys around the crosses, some in the typical white sheets and others not. One guy was talking, but we couldn't hear him that good, but every once in a while the group would yell out stuff like white power, the usual clan bullshit. Heath shook his head and said, "Man, we better get out of here." I agreed and started to turn the boat around. But then, just like in all of these stories, the dumbest thing happened. Link's paddle slapped the water instead of quietly dipping in, and one of the guys turned to look at the river. At first he didn't say anything, and we all froze. Later I figured he didn't see us right away because he'd been staring at two burning things for such a long time, his eyes didn't have time to adjust to see us in the dark. But his buddy next to him turned around too, and he saw us. How do we know? He yells, "Aw, shit! Looky here, boys!" The whole group turned around and stared at us, and frankly focused on Heath. They started shouting, and the N-word was flying through the dark at us. And I said, "Fuck this," and fired up the motor and started jetting back up the river to our camp, which was about a mile away or so. We were zooming along in the dark, and I couldn't tell if anyone was following us, and the motor was too loud to hear anything anyway. But as soon as we got to the camp, we all jumped out, and I said to pull the skiff up into the woods to hide it from anyone who might come by. We're all kinds of freaking out, and Heath gets a fire going despite Link saying we should keep things in the dark in case they come after us. "We've got our shotguns," I said, "and besides, They're not going to do anything stupid. I mean, we're not that far into the boonies. We're far out enough for that shit to happen, said Heath. Now, I don't know why we didn't just pack up and get the hell out of there. But we didn't. We had another few beers to calm down and waited to see if anyone came, but no one did. We skipped the weed and stayed up late making sure that we were going to be okay, and finally we felt like everything was going to be all right. We fell asleep, and later in the night, I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping. Immediately I was wide awake, and I could hear what sounded like 3 or 4 voices whispering. More sounds of footsteps and breaking twigs, and then I knew they were right in our camp. I heard someone open one of our coolers, and someone else was rustling around in our shit. There was some whispering about the darky and some other words I'm not going to say here. Heath tapped my arm to let me know that he was awake too. And then someone walked right by our tent, and I could see and hear him rub against the tent wall fabric. I was freaking out, but quietly reached next to me for my shotgun. In the dark, I could see Heath doing the same thing. I leaned towards him and whispered, "I'm going out there. I don't care." Heath just nodded, and I quickly unzipped the tent door and fairly popped out with my shotgun, and I looked at 4 shapes standing at the edge of our clearing. "Who the hell are you?" I asked as I sensed Heath coming out from the tent. Link did too, and now we're all standing with our shotguns pointed towards the ground as these 4 guys don't say anything. "What do you want?" I asked again, nervous and feeling the adrenaline pumping through my veins. The guys didn't say anything. I mean, this was getting to be a weird standoff, and Heath told them to just get the hell out of there. This drew a laugh, and one of them says, "Shut up, N-word." Right, now I'm angry, and I'm scared, and I'm doing stuff I don't recommend anyone else ever do. I took a step towards them, cycled my 12 gauge, and said, "What the fuck did you just say?" They kind of shuffled back a step, and I took another step towards them. "I don't care who you are or where you're from, go back right now or you're going to see a hospital tonight." Yeah, that's me, Mr. Tough Guy. Link was next to me now and did the same thing. "Get the fuck out of here before I blast your fat redneck ass into next week." One of the guys raised his hand and started to say something, but I told him to shut the fuck up and get out. Heath was now with the 2 of us, and I noticed that our shotguns were now pointed at these guys and no longer pointing at the ground. Slowly, they moved to the river, and we saw that there was a boat there. They all got in, and one yelled back, "You're dead, N-word! We know who you are, N-word!" We heard a motor start, and they moved off down the river. All 3 of us stayed there for quite a while longer, and Link finally said, "I think we better go." I nodded, and we quickly packed up, one of us always keeping an eye on the bank with a shotgun in his hand. The trip back to the trucks in the dark was scary as hell, and we kept looking over our shoulders in the dark to see if anyone was coming. We got back to the business lot, and without incident. By now it was about 5 in the morning, and I said, "Hey, let's go to this diner outside of Slidell." So we drive there, and we're all talking about what had happened and how messed up it was. We parked our trucks, and then we were eating, and that's when Heath noticed that he couldn't find his wallet. He looked everywhere, and then went out to the truck, checking around it, and checking everything that we had packed, but it just wasn't there. He was super pissed, but there wasn't much he could do about it. So we decided to just go home, and I dropped him off at home, and then went back to my place and crashed. We went back the next day looking for it, but it wasn't at the business, and it wasn't at the campsite we had. And I'll tell you what, it took a lot of courage for both of us to go back to that campsite. I didn't talk to Heath for a couple of days, but then he did call me at work and told me that someone came to his house in the night and graffitied all this shit about "Get out, N-word," and "We know where you live," and there was a note in his mailbox in shitty handwriting that said, "You dumb N-word, you left your wallet outside your tent." Heath was going apeshit. He called the cops, but there wasn't much they could do but make out a report, and it ended up being one of the last weeks Heath stayed in our town. He moved to his cousins in Houston, Texas, and got a job out there, and that's where he is to this day. His parents left town shortly after, and I don't blame them for that either. This was all a long time ago, but it still says something about this world we live in, where there are still hick assholes out doing this kind of stuff. It's scary as hell, and the fact that they showed up at his house is even scarier. As I said, we're all still really good friends, and I'd do anything for my buddy. This was almost 20 years ago, but if I ever found out who those asshole rednecks were, there's gonna be trouble. Camping with Bigfoot by Justin H. I wasn't sure how I was going to start this story. I've always been one to embrace the superstitions in life. When I was growing up, my uncles would tell my brothers and I stories. Stories of how someone who they knew had spotted Bigfoot at the north end of one of the state parks we used to go to. I always thought about that. Thought about going to the north end, where there were trees so thick that at the brightest part of the day, nothing more than a foot's distance from you could be seen. I imagined being brave and venturing into the forest to find a Bigfoot. I never actually did, of course, but probably would have if I ever found my way back. Anyway, this may or may not have had an effect on what happened on the camping trip I'm about to tell you about. I just felt it might be worth mentioning. One thing is certain. If it happened to all of us. We set up camp around noon on a nice late summer day. One of our cousins came with my brothers and uncle on this trip, and it was her first time camping with us. I'm not sure how old we were at the time, but I think I was around 10 or 11. My two brothers, one around 13, the other 7, as well as our cousin who was 13, were all stoked to get to our destination. We loved the sense of adventure when we were with our uncle. He used to pick out various spots deep in the woods to camp, and some of our best times as kids were hanging out and camping with our uncle. This spot in particular, we had been to once before with no eventful occurrences that I can recall. We usually started out the day by finding kindling to add to the wood my uncle would chop for the night's fire, and shortly after arriving and picking up as many sticks as our little arms could carry, my cousin said something which I immediately responded to. She said she felt like someone was watching her. The hairs on the back of my neck were already standing up before this, but after she said it, I got a little scared. We went to meet with my brothers to investigate, and we looked around camp, searching for signs of other people, houses, animals, yet nothing was there. We were in the middle of nowhere, 3+ miles from any road. The day moved on, but something just didn't feel right. I remember feeling like I should have looked over my shoulder constantly. I was getting a bad vibe, something I knew wasn't right. Sure, my cousin having said something earlier didn't help, but why was a sixth sense seemingly telling me something? I just didn't know what it was. After setting up camp, we all decided to go for a walk down this trail that was very close. And after walking for about 10 minutes or so, we came to a clearing. The trail basically stopped and opened into a large field with a single red barn on top of a hill. This was very odd, as there were no houses, let alone roads for a few miles in any direction. And the strange feeling returned, and this time came to all of us. After some deliberation of whether we should check it out, we decided to head back to camp. For the rest of the day, we hung out by the fire and just talked. As night approached and the sun finally set, we stuck close to the fire and started to forget. Forget the notion that something strange was going on. Then it happened. My uncle was partially standing and sitting on his car when he felt it move. He said that the front felt like it was dropping, and I remember him thinking it was his brother trying to sneak up on us. Our other uncle was the only one who knew about this particular camping spot. But then it happened again. This time we could easily see the car dip, and it would have taken 3 or 4 men to make it drop that far. The hood was hitting the dirt, and my uncle slid off. Not knowing what to do, we heard thuds of something running behind the car. and we were frozen with fear, and there was nothing we could do. I mean, the only weapon we had was an axe, which was laid next to a tree somewhere back there. And then suddenly, the most frightening moment of my life was before me. A huge, dark figure appeared beyond the fire. Still frozen with fright, we could only look at this strange creature as it stared at us with some of the biggest, reddest eyes we had ever seen. I can remember the only visible features on this creature were its red eyes and white hair on top of its broad shoulders. As quickly as it appeared, it was gone. We could hear trees falling as it ran into the dark night. I mean, it was moving that fast. And that's when we started to move even faster. We grabbed what we could with our hands, shaking with fear, not knowing if it would return. We jumped into the car, ready to tear away like something fierce, and at that moment, the worst-case scenario happened. The car didn't start. My uncle tried it again. It still wouldn't go. One more time, and nothing. After the fourth attempt, the small Cavalier finally started, and we were gone. We made it back to my uncle's house around 4 a.m, and we tried to make sense of what had happened, but could only agree that it had to have been a Bigfoot. There was nothing else that the creature resembled. After daybreak and no way to fall asleep with the phenomena that had just happened, we decided to go back for our tents and equipment that we had left. When we arrived, everything looked intact. Searching around the perimeter, we found our cooler tipped over and emptied, with soda and an open loaf of bread scattered across the dirt. One of our tents was on its side. To confirm what we heard that night, there were a number of trees knocked over that were clearly standing the day before. We just gathered everything up without incident and left. Many years have passed, and I have told the story to only a few people. To this very day, not myself, my brothers or cousin have returned to that spot deep in the woods. My uncle went by himself a few years later without any incident, but the supernatural disturbance that could only be defined as Bigfoot still lingers with me. To this day, when I hear a strange story or scary phenomenon, I think of that day and wonder, was it really Bigfoot? Or was it a correlation of events that happened that day, which made an average animal appear to be something more? I guess we will never know. Terror in the woods. For many years, my husband Alan, his brother Sean, and I have enjoyed getting into the great outdoors, which includes a lot of hiking and fishing, especially for my brother-in-law, who considers himself a kind of expert in fly fishing. When we camped by a beautiful, secluded river last spring, Sean was ecstatic. Alan and I woke up early one morning and decided to go for a hike and do some wild strawberry picking. Naturally, Sean declined as he wanted to try his luck again with fly fishing the pristine river next to us. The day turned out to be glorious, so we decided to keep hiking and picking while Sean continued fishing. It was almost twilight when we returned to camp, and as soon as we arrived, I had a feeling that something wasn't right. Our tents were undisturbed, and nothing seemed out of place, apart from the fact that Sean was missing. Alan found his line and gear on the banks of the river, and slowly, panic started to creep in. We searched high and low, well into the night, using our flashlights, and just as we were about to give up and call the authorities, we heard yelling coming from the river. We scrambled down the mountain and past the tents, and then skidded to a stop when we saw something emerging from the water. At first, it looked like a mud monster, staggering from out of the water and then falling to its knees. When Sean's voice groaned loudly, we knew it was him. Alan yelled to me about getting a blanket while he ran over to his brother, and on my way over with the blanket, I saw that Sean was completely naked. He was covered in mud, but when Alan told him to go with him to the river to wash it off, he screamed, "No!" Alan and I looked at each other, not knowing what had happened, as Sean wouldn't speak after that. We wrapped him in the blanket and sat him in front of the fire, and it took a while before he told us what had happened. We had left to go hiking, and Sean had started setting up to fish, when he heard something in the middle of the river, like a gurgling sound. Thinking that it was either a drowning animal or a freak whirlpool, he put on his waders and made his way into the water. He said the last thing that he remembered was being dragged under. While we listened to his story, he began to shudder and shake his head like he was trying to shake off a terrible memory. We pressed him to go on, and he finally blurted out that he had been attacked by some kind of monster. Alan and I looked at each other, obviously thinking the same thing. Sean was hallucinating. We gave him a warm cup of cocoa and soon got him off to sleep. The next morning, Alan was able to take him to the edge of the river to wash the mud off. My blood froze when Alan yelled at me to come over. I couldn't believe the horrible scratches, gouges, and bite marks on Sean's flesh. He looked like he was covered in bizarre markings. There were strange circular rashes on his torso, which Sean explained, while sobbing, that they were marks left by the monster's tentacles or something. There were strange scratches up and down his legs, like he'd been whipped by a cat o' nine tails, and he also had many deep cuts. The freakiest wounds were the bite marks, which looked more like he'd been bitten by a large bird beak. As we cleaned him up and administered first aid, we heard the same strange gurgling, bubbling sound coming from the river. Sean just started screaming and raced up the mountain before he even got dressed. Alan jumped up and started packing our gear without even checking out the creepy sounds, and he said to me, "We're not waiting to find out, let's go." It wasn't long before we raced after Sean back to safety. All three of us still don't have the guts to go back and figure out what happened that day, or what unholy creature lives in that river. Attacked in the Night by Arkansas Ted. This happened in 1991 while I was granted 72-hour liberty in Ecuador due to a successful drug interdiction. There were 4 of us Americans, with 2 Ecuadorian and 2 Peruvian fellows making up our party. One of the Ecuadorian guys asked if we wanted to go camping for a couple of days. Hang out, do some fishing, get drunk. We said hell yeah, and he did know the perfect spot. A rocky outcropping that held a small pool with a freshwater waterfall and a beautiful western beach that laid bare the Pacific Ocean. It was late by the time we got all set up the first night, so we all sacked out to greet a morning and day full of fun, sun, and fishing. The morning was great, and a couple of guys jetted off back to town for the morning market and some paper, rum, beer, frozen squid for bait, and a whole bunch of water. We foraged for wood and got all the fishing gear ready, etc., while those guys were gone. The guys came back with everything needed to eat our asses off, but they got the booze all backwards. They got 1 case of beer and 1 case of rum. The rum came in a triangle bottle that was about as tall and wide as a tall boy beer. It was good, and I've never had any rum like it since. It was tasty. You could almost drink it straight without it taking your breath away. So we fished, drank, and ate like kings all the way into the night, and then kicked back and watched the big screen TV called Our Galaxy while we were jamming out to the local radio station. It was wonderful. The only thing that could have made us any happier is if our women could have been with us. This was mentioned many times throughout the day and evening by everyone. Around 2300 hours, we started hearing howling and barking. One of the Peruvian guy grabbed his Ecuadorian guy friend who suggested the camp location. We looked at each other with that what the fuck look. We thought a fight had started, but no. It turned out the Peruvian guy was from northern Peru that bordered the Amazon, and he knew that sound. Monkeys. They explained that it shouldn't be a problem as long as we kept the fire going and the radio playing. I did mention that we'd been in the sun eating and drinking all day, right? Around 0100 hours, that was my best guess, we were all stone drunk playing some card game. The monkeys had faded into the background in our minds, and I'm saying 0100 hours because that's when all hell broke loose. These strong little motherfuckers attacked us. They jumped on us and started beating our asses. They chased us to the cars and then went about eating our food and drinking our booze. Now, listen, you've got to understand, these little bastards didn't just grab and run. They came and showed us what they took from us. They threw shit on the windows, screamed at us, pointed their asses at us, broke the radio, then hung out by the fire getting fucked up on our booze. And here are 8 tough guys bleeding and sulking with the windows rolled up, sweating our asses off in the cars. One of the monkeys had dropped an unopened bottle of rum by the car next to me, and I retrieved that, and we passed along the bottle while planning revenge, and knowing we needed water. In the end, we decided to bum rush them, grab the fishing poles to defend ourselves, and as soon as we ran towards them, they bugged out, but not empty-handed. The drunk little bastards. And for your information, monkeys get wasted fast. We ended up laughing it off. What else could we do? We gathered what was left, hung out, and drank rum and water until we passed out. We never knew if they came back, nor did we care. Hey, they had won fair and square. My advice, never camp where there is a possibility of a monkey invasion. They will stalk you, and they can attack, especially the ones that jumped us. Heed their name, Calicebus Lucifer. What My Daughter Saw, submitted by O. Henry 12. My family always went camping as a rule. I grew up that way and continued the tradition with my own family. We would go to a lot of different places with our gear and enjoy nature for what it was instead of doing things like Disneyland and stuff like that. When my daughter was born in 1996, my wife and I took her for her first camping trip, and she was great on it, and we decided that because she was that good, we knew she could handle it, and we were going to make camping a family thing going forward. And we did. We went on a ton of trips and had a lot of fun. When my daughter was 10, we took a camping trip to a state park in the state I'm from. It was just like a lot of other places that we had been, and it was just for the weekend, so it wasn't anything super fancy. It was just a quick getaway from home and work. When we got there weren't many others tent camping in our area that we stayed at. We did see other people in the cabin area, of course, and there were other people out there, but no one was within 4 or 5 campsites from us on either side. After setting up camp, we were all sitting at a picnic table trying to decide what to do with the day. Go to the little lake that was in the park, go on a hike, or whatever. While we were chatting away, a camp mug that I had set down on the picnic table suddenly slid across it and fell off of it on the far end. All of us looked at it and thought, geez, that's weird. There was no wind, and we were all sitting pretty calmly and not rocking the table back and forth. There was really no explanation as to why that mug slid all the way across the table. I tried to make a joke out of it and said, oh, this campsite must be haunted, and it made my daughter and wife laugh. I just picked up the mug, put it back on the table, and we forgot about it. We opted for a hike, and that's what we did. We were gone for about 2 or 3 hours, and when we returned to camp, it was time to eat, so I set up my camp stove and also started getting a fire going. I was going to roast corn and potatoes in the fire and fry up some fish that we had purchased fresh that morning. As I was getting the fire going, I looked at my camp stove, and it was one of those green Coleman white gas ones. You know, the kind that folds up on the side and has 3 burners? Well, as I was looking at it, it collapsed, the lid slammed down, and again, there was no wind. I couldn't figure out how it happened, but I figured maybe I just hadn't set it up properly. So I walked over to the picnic table where it was set up, put the sides in their slots again, and then went back to the fire. Before I even got to it, I heard the lid on the stove slam down again. Of course, when I turned around, it's exactly what I saw. The stove had collapsed again. I didn't know what to think, but for whatever reason, I just got the fire going and then went back to the stove, set it up again, and continued on with my meal prep. I didn't mention this to my wife, and certainly didn't mention it to my daughter. I just got our food taken care of without any further incident, and then we sat around the campfire that evening without anything else happening. When we woke up in the morning, I was going to the communal bathroom to get cleaned up while my wife and daughter got their breakfast stuff together. She had just taken my daughter to the showers and was coming back when I was leaving. We were going to have cereal, a huge hit with my daughter. You know those little boxes of cereal that you can turn into a bowl? The big variety pack. I love those things myself. My daughter chose a box and set it on the picnic table while my wife went to our cooler to get milk. Suddenly, the box basically exploded, throwing cereal all over the place. My daughter screamed and fell back off the picnic bench she was on. She was so scared. Now, there was no sound, just the box popping open and shooting the cereal all over. I came running back when I heard my daughter scream. My wife said she didn't know what happened. She hadn't seen anything. Her back had been turned while she was getting the milk, and when she turned around, all she saw was the cereal all over the table. I'm a pretty skeptical guy, but this was getting really odd. Too many goofy things were happening for my liking. So I calmly got another box of cereal for my daughter, told my wife it was no big deal, and something must have happened with the packaging of the cereal that made it do that. I don't know. I was grasping at straws at this point. We ate a quick breakfast and decided to go down to the lake for the morning, and we did. But we didn't talk about what had happened. We just wanted to enjoy the summer day at this little beach on the lake. We went back to our campsite and just got in a truck to go to a lunch place a few miles outside of the park. After we ate, we wandered around this little town that was really cute, looking in the shops and such. But all the while, I kept thinking about the weird stuff that was happening at our campsite. How in the hell could all of that stuff actually be happening? I mean, we weren't imagining it. It was really happening. Eventually, we went back to the campsite for dinner, and as I was getting it ready, my wife took my daughter to the shower house to get cleaned up. I wasn't talking about it to either of them, and I was really preoccupying all my thoughts, though. It was just so strange. I mean, what was happening? Or rather, what had happened earlier? So, nothing happened during dinner, and I built another fire for us to enjoy. We were going to be heading home in the morning, and we just wanted to have one more fun night. So while we sat around the campfire, it got dark, and I was just telling funny family stories, and my daughter was talking about going into the 5th grade. She was really excited to go back to school to see her friends. Suddenly, she stopped and stared over my shoulder into the forest behind me. "What's up, sweetie?" I asked her. Her eyes got big, and suddenly she just screamed her head off. I mean, it literally made me jump out of my lawn chair. My wife screeched a little too. She was taken aback so much. She held my daughter's hand while I whirled around to see what the heck she had just seen. There was nothing there, but my daughter was still crying, and I had to ask her again, "Sweetheart, what did you just see?" Through her tears and blubbering, she said, "A man, Dad, a bloody man." Again, I looked over at the forest, walked to the edge of it, and even went into the trees for a little bit, but there was no one there. I went back to the campfire and said, "Sweetie, there's no one there. Are you sure that's what you saw?" She nodded her head and said, "Dad, there was a bloody man standing there just watching us." Well, that was it. My wife decided that we were leaving right then and there, and I agreed as I didn't want my daughter to spend the night terrified out there. I started to pack everything up, took the tent down, and my wife and daughter just sat by the fire. Then my wife got up to help me get everything into my truck. Once we were loaded, we got in for the drive home. As I was backing out of our campsite onto the little road that would lead us out of the park, my headlights illuminated the forest behind our site, and my blood ran cold. There was a bloody man standing at the edge of the forest, but he wasn't really all there, if you know what I mean. He was kind of transparent, the typical ghost kind of thing that you hear about. I couldn't believe it was happening. I blinked, looked back up, but the man was gone. I'm telling you, I know he was there, and I saw him as plain as day. I didn't say anything about it to my wife or daughter. We drove home and got in bed, everyone a little shaken up still, and we were talking about what had happened at the campsite. Finally, I put a stop to it, saying that we were all very tired, and all we were doing was getting ourselves worked up even more. My wife agreed, and my daughter didn't really want to talk about it anymore either. The next day, I called the ranger's office at the park to let them know what was going on at that campsite, at the risk of them thinking I was crazy. The ranger was an older guy who listened to me, and when I actually told him, "Look, man, don't think I'm crazy," he paused for a moment and then said, "You're not. And you're not the first person to tell us of something strange happening at that loop of campsites." He then went on to tell me that 20 years before, a guy who was camping there by himself was attacked and mauled by a bear. He laid there by himself, sustaining a lot of injuries before someone found him and took him to the hospital, but sadly, even though he did get to the hospital, he lost his life. I can't imagine what it's like to be mauled by a bear, and I don't want to think about it. The ranger didn't say that what I saw and the guy were connected. He just made mention that a guy had been killed out there. I didn't tell my wife or daughter about that right away, and I kept it to myself. When my daughter was 18 or so, I did let them know what the ranger had told me, and they were both shocked. I am convinced that the spirit of that poor bastard is still out there in that park at those campsites. I only wish we hadn't seen him. My encounter with the wild man. My eyes were open, but all I could see was darkness, pure black. A vague cloud of charcoal swirled in front of my eyes, and I struggled to gain focus. I knew where I was, but I was unable to do anything about it. I was laying on my back, incapable of movement, and my heart was racing, and pounding more like it. I was frozen solid, sweating, and scared out of my mind. My eyes were the only thing I seemed to have control of, and even then, they were failing me. I had been in this frozen, pitch-black state for what seemed like an eternity, but in reality, it was only a matter of seconds. I had woken in an instant, and before I was even fully awake, knew what was going on. I could sense the danger and smell the rancid breeze before my brain could even realize what was happening. The situation was this. I was alone, hundreds of miles from civilization, camping in a small one-man tent during a month-long bicycle tour across British Columbia, Canada. I was in a tent, all alone, in the middle of a vast forest, and I was frozen solid. From inside my sleeping bag cocoon, I could sense the movement of a large, sulphurous animal making its way through the brush on the left side of my tent, no more than 30 feet away. I could hear the animal's footsteps as the weight of the creature pressed down on a thick layer of dead leaves and soft earth. I've spent more than a decade camping in remote locations all around the world, so I've heard large animals moving through the forest at night. I've seen deer, moose, elk, bear, raccoons, wolves, bobcats, and even mountain lions. But this was nothing like those other animals. This thing was huge, was clearly walking through the trees on 2 massive feet, and it was getting closer to my tent. Seconds passed, but they seemed like hours. I tried not to breathe, fearing the animal might hear me and come closer to investigate, but in the back of my mind, I knew that whatever was out there was already well aware of my presence. I hoped that the creature would get bored and eventually go away, so I tried to slow my breathing, and I waited. The stillness is what scared me the most. The forest was so quiet, unnaturally quiet. There were no singing birds, no critters crawling. The wind wasn't blowing, and the nearby brooks were silent. All I could hear was my rapid heartbeat and every slow breath. But then, just as I thought I had been imagining the entire thing, a branch cracked, and there was a quick shuffle in the brush on the left side of my tent. That's when I realized that this was actually happening. When I was in 6th grade, I had written a 2-page paper about Bigfoot. I had watched a bunch of documentaries on the History Channel and subsequently became fascinated with the creature. Fascinated and frightened. When my father took me hiking through the Sierra Nevada mountain range a year later, I excelled in the wild, but was scared of going off on my own, not out of fear of wild animals like bear or moose, but because I thought I might run into Bigfoot. Years later, I realized just how silly it had been of me to believe that Bigfoot was a real-life creature. I mean, after all, no good evidence for the beast seems to exist. Casts of massive footprints have been taken, and shaky video evidence shows little of any true living creature. So, when I grew to the age where I could think for myself, I let Bigfoot go. I traveled the world, spent years roaming around by myself in forests, deserts, and jungles, and never once did I see any evidence for a massive, hairy monkey man living in the woods. That is, of course, until this very moment, when I knew in an instant that something huge was stalking me as I lay in my tent in the woods of British Columbia. I couldn't yet see the beast, but I knew that it was there. Still on my back and covered in darkness, I lay listening. Even the slightest movement of the animal could be heard and felt. The forest is funny like that. When you're laying on the ground, you can even feel the slightest footstep of a creature on the other side of the forest. The earth moves, and you can feel it. And I was on high alert, so my body was picking up on everything. That's when the creature moved again. There was a loud crack in the brush, and my heart instantly began fluttering. It was like going from 60 to 110 in a millisecond, and all it took was a single step by an animal no more than 20 feet away from my tent. One step is all it took. That's all I needed to shock me back into reality. I was completely alone, trapped inside my sleeping bag, laying on the ground inside a thin layer of tent, and I had no way of defending myself. I had a knife in one of my panniers, but in order to get my knife, I'd need to first unzip my sleeping bag, and even if I could do that without attracting the attention of the animal, I still had to find the knife inside of one of my panniers, crawl out of my tent, and prepare to put up a fight. The odds were against me, so instead, I just stayed where I was and listened. The silence is what made this experience so frightening. The animal would take a step, sometimes two, and then it would just sit there and not move. And we'd both be listening. Me listening to it, and it listening to me. And when one of us moved, the other would too. I'd take a deep breath or shift my body just an inch or two, and the creature would move forward, one slow step at a time. A few minutes passed, but it felt like an eternity. I could tell that the animal was getting closer. Its stench was horrific, but its presence was even more frightening. Even though I couldn't actually see the animal, I could feel just how big it was. The earth rumbled in a slow, almost monstrous tone each time the animal moved one of its feet and laid them to rest in the leaves outside of my tent. I could smell the wet air surrounding this beast and practically taste the dirt and disease that hung off this creature's body. Its filth would be apparent from several hundred feet away, but by now it was no more than 10 feet from where I was lying. It was so close to me now that I could hear it breathing. My heart was racing, my face was dripping with sweat, and I was sure this was going to be the moment that my life came to an end. My whole life flashed before my eyes. I thought about what it might be like for my friends and family to never know what happened to me. They'd have a hard time finding me, after all. I was camped out in the middle of the forest far from home. I hadn't really told anyone where I'd be, and I'd hiked back from the main road several hundred feet. It would be weeks or months before anyone found my tent and bicycle in these dense trees. It would be weeks or months before anyone found my tent and bicycle in these dense trees, let alone my body. The creature moved forward again, and now it was just inches from the outside of my tent. It was massive, and it cast a faint shadow on the exterior of my tent, and I could see just how big this animal truly was. It was huge! Even though I had already accepted my fate, I decided to give myself one last chance at life. I wasn't going to lie down and die. I was going to fight. So, just as I saw this animal's massive hand reaching towards my tent. I sat up inside my sleeping bag and screamed. Whatever it was ran away. I never found out what it was. I just listened to its heavy footsteps walk, or more to the point, run, from my tent. In the morning, I woke up, packed my things, and continued on my journey through the Sierra Nevada. I never heard from whatever that was, whatever thing that was, again. Messed Up Camping Trip, submitted by Jenny O 412. Hey, this happened to me in the summer of 2015. A group of my friends decided to go camping and hiking at this trail about an hour from our home. Where it was is not important, but what happened out there is. I probably should be more forthcoming about the name of the trail and the state that I'm telling this story from, but I don't want anybody to know who I am. It's not that I'm worried about myself, I just don't want any publicity. Our group got together, and we all got our stuff ready to go when we were ready to head out to the trail and go camping. There were 4 of us, 2 couples. Me, I'll call myself Jenny. My boyfriend I will call Todd. My friend Krista, and her boyfriend I'll call Bob. We were planning on hiking and camping along this trail that was a loop of about 30 miles. We were going to take it easy and go around it in about 10-mile increments. We would stop after 10 miles, set up camp at a site we could find that was open, and just hang out and have a few glasses of wine or whiskey as we enjoyed the wilderness and our company. We hit the trailhead and made our way to our first stop. There was no one there at the lean-to when we got there, and we were excited that we would be out there with just the 4 of us. Totally stoked, we set up camp. The guys got a fire going for our campfire cheer. My boyfriend Todd broke out a bottle of wine and poured everyone a glass. Right, don't take us as massive drunks, but we had an entire backpack full of wine that Todd had carried on his chest. Yeah, lulz. Anyway, we all had a few glasses of wine, and we were just winding down watching the sunset over the trees, when we heard the snap and footsteps of someone coming up the trail towards the campsite. It was this guy. He looked disheveled and smelly, to say the least. I mean, frankly, he looked like a homeless guy that I would see on the downtown streets of the city that we lived in. Not wanting to be rude or be jerks, we invited him over to have some of our meal, which now involved hot dogs. This guy sat down, thanked us, and said that he was hiking from the north to the south all the way across the United States. He was interested in taking pictures of every place that he had been and the people that he would meet, so he asked us while he ate a hot dog if he could take pictures of us. Well, like I said, we were a couple of glasses of wine deep, so we said sure. He asked us our names, and we told him our first names but not our last names. I think we all felt that that would have been a little weird. He took some pictures of us, had another hot dog and a cookie, and then said he was going to continue to walk down the trail for another couple of miles while it was still light out. As it was dusk, it was starting to get dark while we watched the sunset, but there was still enough light for him to walk down the trail. We didn't think anything of it until Krista said, "Do you guys think that guy was weird?" I told her that he was probably just some guy that was hiking and we shouldn't think too much about it. But yeah, he did look kind of spaced out. The guys just said he looked like some dude who was high on life and probably high on the ganj and just enjoying some of his time out in the woods. I wish that had been the case, because what happened next is the reason I sent you this story. We all went to sleep a little bit later that night after taking care of our food and putting it in a bear bag and hoisting it up into a tree, and then letting the fire die down. We crawled into our tents for a much-needed sleep to get ready for the next day. But when we woke up, we all found out that leaving our boots outside of our tent was a bad idea, because the laces of our boots had been removed. I mean, literally, they were stolen. They'd been taken. We couldn't find them anywhere around our campsite, and there was absolutely no reason that we would have done that on our own as a prank. But, nonetheless, all of our bootlaces were gone. I looked at my boyfriend and said, "Todd, what the hell are we going to do now?" Todd, being the everlasting woodsman and outdoor freak, said that he actually brought extra laces, but only for 2 pairs of boots. We talked about what we were going to do, and I figured that there was a little town off the trail about 3 miles away that someone could go and get extra laces. I mean, at least that's what we were hoping. So for the next few miles until we got to that cross trail, Todd and Bob wore boots with no laces, and they were struggling. It's tough enough walking on an off-road trail, but without laced-up boots, it made it that much harder. When we got to the cross trail, which was actually a logging road, we switched laces and gave them to Krista and Bob and told them to run as fast as they could to town, which was about a mile away, and see if we could get extra laces. During that time, my boyfriend and I just hung out. Todd, God bless him, was feeling a little frisky and wanted to have a roll in the grass. We were pretty stinky from the hike so far, but I obliged, and that's exactly what we did. Right, full disclosure, I'm married now, but I still think of that time with him, and I'm pretty sure he does too. I hope that doesn't make me a slut. At any rate, Krista and Bob came back about an hour after we had made love, and they had extra laces. They weren't really the laces for our boots that we needed, but they were the kind that were waxy and would do for the rest of our trip. So we set off again for the next campsite, and none of us talking about who took our laces or what had happened during the night. As a matter of fact, Bob said that it was probably squirrels or some other forest animal that took them. We all laughed about that, but hey, who knows? We went down the trail to the next campsite, and again, when we got there, there was no one there. So we set up the same way we had the night before. We indulged in more noodles and, of course, more wine and whiskey. That's when we heard someone coming up the trail behind us. And no shit, it was the same guy from the day before. He looked the same, and we couldn't blame him because we were all wearing the same clothes too. But there he was in our midst again and acting like he had never seen us before. He gave us the same spiel as before, and we didn't know what to do other than go along with it, so we did. We gave him some food, and he ate some more that he had brought, and then once again he asked us to take some pictures. At this point I was kind of wigged out and looked at Todd with a, "Hey, let's walk over there so we can talk" look. You know, the eyebrow thing. He picked up on it, and we walked away from everybody else to talk. Immediately Todd said, "Is this fucking happening? Are we seriously talking to this guy again?" I told him I felt the same way, and that's why I wanted to get away from everyone to talk about this. He said he was not okay with what was going on, but didn't want to have a huge confrontation. I told him we should just sit on it and see what happened and then go from there, even though I was kind of freaking out. Todd said that he was going to keep his 9mm on his hip from now on, rather than keeping it in his pack, and that's what he did. We went back to our campsite, Todd got his gun, and we stoked up another fire, and once again the guy wandered away up the trail. When we were sure he was out of hearing range, Todd and I talked to Krista and Bob about the whole thing, and they too were wondering what the hell was going on. That's when Krista pointed to a white piece of something on the trail, and I ran over to it. It was a Polaroid of me and my boyfriend going at it. We were kind of embarrassed, but I snatched it out of her hand, stuck it in my pack, and just said, "Oh well, I guess that guy's a shutterbug," trying to play the whole thing off, meanwhile terrified into my heart. We relaxed, had another glass of wine, but a little while later we heard some horrific screaming coming from the woods, but we couldn't tell where it was coming from. They weren't human screams. They were screams of an animal. I don't know how to really describe it, but it wasn't like a human being screaming. I mean, now there's lots of animals out in that territory. I've never heard anything like that before. And Todd said we should just go to sleep, get up early, and get moving. He was going to stay up late by the fire to watch over things, because he was feeling uneasy. He didn't actually say he was feeling uneasy, but I know what he was going after when he said he was going to stay up late. He wanted to protect us. The next morning, we all woke up, packed up quick, and got ready for the next part of our trek. This was our last leg through the woods before we got to a little town where we were going to stay at a motel and then get a ride back to our car. About 2 miles from the last campsite, we noticed something funny on the trees on the side of the trail. It was something I had never seen before, but the guys recognized the guts and the stomach of an animal. They were both hunters. Todd and Bob knew right away that something was out of the ordinary as these guts were hanging from the trees and stretched out to their maximum length. Krista and I didn't say anything. We were just walking along past them. Todd and Bob kind of lolled behind and then whispered something to one another. We kept walking, but I couldn't help notice that Bob also took his handgun out of his pack and holstered it. We continued walking down the trail, and we were all really feeling weirded out. I mean, something was just not right. And I'm not just talking about the stuff that was hanging in the trees or all the other stuff. We just didn't feel alone anymore. All that crap with the weirdo showing up 2 nights in a row had our minds racing. And none of us brought it up or spoke about it. But I know we were all thinking it. I mean, I know that because that's what we talked about after this whole ordeal. As we got to the main road that would take us back to the motel, we kind of stopped, and we looked back down the trail. And there he was, standing in the middle of it, with his camera up, still taking pictures of us. That guy. That creepy weirdo guy. I couldn't help but notice that his hands had blood on them. We all stood there looking at him for at least 30 seconds before he raised his hand, which was bloody, and he waved at us and then turned around and just walked back down the trail. I looked at Todd and just said, "What the fuck?" And we all decided to hightail it to the motel. We didn't even stay there. We all took showers, got cleaned up, and then called a cab company for a ride back to our car. We didn't want to spend one more instant out in that space. Who knows what the fuck that guy was doing, but holy shit, we know he was following us, and we know he was taking pictures of us the entire time. I still have that Polaroid of me on top of Todd. I hate to think that my face and the face of all my friends is somehow tacked up in some shack in the middle of the woods owned by that guy. I mean, seriously, it's been years, but what a fucking creep. Lost. Submitted by Bebopalula. This story doesn't have any ghosts or monsters or Bigfoot or whatever, but it's the scariest thing that ever happened to me. When I was in my 20s, I was engaged to be married, and a couple of months before the wedding, my fiancée decided she didn't want to get married anymore, basically gave me back the ring, and then took off to Florida. We lived in Colorado at the time, and she just up and took off. It blew me away, and blew everyone away. Her parents were pissed, my family was dumbstruck, and all of her friends were completely WTF. Anyway, you can imagine I was kind of in the dumps. I needed to get away from everything, and my job was really cool when they found out what happened. They allowed me to take time off and not charge me for vacation. I mean, they knew how upset I was. I thought that was really cool. I still talk to a lot of those people, and my old boss to this day. After lounging around the house for a day or two feeling terrible and sorry for myself, I decided to go on a hiking trip and do a little camping, and I figured I could go out and just clear my head and do some thinking about where my life was headed. So I gathered up my gear, I had to buy some other stuff, loaded up my pack, and off I went. I told my parents and my brother where I was headed, and they just said to be safe. At first, my mom tried to talk me out of going by myself, but she saw that I really needed to be alone and figure things out. I arrived at a trailhead midday, and it was a couple-hour drive for me to get where I wanted to go, so, leaving my car behind, I began to make my trek. I brought enough provisions for about 3 days and figured I would connect some of the trails to extend the hike. The first day was awesome, and I saw a couple of people also hiking, but I learned from them that the trail I was on had pretty light usage and I wouldn't really be seeing a lot of people. In a way that made me feel good because I didn't want to be around people, but at the same time, it also made me a little nervous that I wouldn't be seeing a lot of folks, and without being too negative and thinking something bad would happen, I was conscious of the fact that if something did go wrong, I'd be in trouble. Truth be told, trouble is what I eventually found myself in. I stopped to camp as the sun was going down and figured I would just set up my little Whisperlight stove and make some noodles. I was just going to bivvy out there and not sleep in a tent, although I did bring one. After I ate, I cleaned up and sat back with a bottle of Maker's Mark and just sat thinking about everything that was happening to me. After a bit, I went to sleep, and the next day brought more of the same. Great hiking, awesome views, some interesting people who wanted to stop and chat, but they were few and far between. I camped again as the sun was going down, trying to relax and think about where I was headed, and I know it was early on in this whole thing with my ex-fiancée taking off, but I was starting to look at her a little differently and put things into perspective. I was working hard about not being angry with her and trying to just focus on myself. I realized that wasting time on a person like that is just that, wasted time. The next morning, I noticed the skies getting dark and was thinking I should start heading back and maybe take some trails towards my car, so the next day I'd be able to complete the hike and get into my car and go home. Unfortunately, the rain came, and this was not just rain. This was a hell of a thunderstorm. I don't know if you've ever been out in that area, but you can see the storms coming, and you can see the lightning and you can hear the thunder, and it's really beautiful to be honest, but also kind of scary, especially when you know you're out in the middle of nowhere without shelter. I found a little outcropping of rocks and held up there as the really heavy stuff came down. I just sat there listening to the thunder boom all around me. Man, it was so loud. After a while, the rain stopped and I started my hike again, and looking at an old map, I thought I would take a shortcut that would get me back to my car a little faster. I would have one more night to stay out there, but I figured this would save me some time. I mean, I was having a blast, but I was also at that point where I was ready to go home. So, off I went down this trail. I realized, after about an hour, that something was not right about it. It didn't really feel like a trail anymore. It was kind of like bushwhacking, but not really serious bushwhacking. I mean, it just didn't feel like a trail. I guess that's the only way I can describe it. Up to this point, everything I was walking on had been clearly defined, and you could tell that people used it all the time. I was now on something that looked like no one had been out there for years. So I stopped, looked at this crappy map that I had brought, and thought if I made a beeline straight away from this trail, I would find another trail that would get me back to where I needed to be. I started to make my way across between these two trails that the map said were there, and realized pretty fast that this was probably a really stupid idea. I had my compass out, but the way I was walking, I was kind of zigzagging all over the place, and not being able to keep a straight direction. Part of that was due to the terrain. It just wasn't a straight shot like I thought it was going to be. So I'm out there thinking that I'm heading in the right direction. Not realizing that I'm not, but my compass says I am. Night's starting to fall, and I realize I'm going to have to stay out here, even though there's no ideal places to stop. After finding a somewhat decent place, I stopped, ate something, and realized that in the morning I was going to have to figure something out because this map was useless now. It was kind of useless to begin with. I was pissed off at myself for making a stupid decision like this instead of staying on the trail. If there's any moral of the story in this, it's stay on the trail. In the morning, I woke up and looked at that dumb map again for whatever reason. I got my bearings, checked my compass, and started heading in a direction that I knew there had to be a trail. I walked and walked and walked all day long and did not come across any trail. I couldn't figure out how this was humanly possible. I mean, it didn't make any sense. There had to be something out there, no matter what direction I went in, but I wasn't coming across anything or anyone. I started to realize I was on the edge of being really screwed. I remember sitting down to try to think things through and keep calm. That's another moral of the story. Keep calm. I did, but at this point I knew I was lost, and I didn't know how I was going to get out of here. It kind of felt like I was in the Blair Witch Project, where the people are walking around and around, and they're just going in circles. That wasn't the exact case with me, it just felt like that. Night was coming again, and I thought to myself, well, I'm going to have to stay out here again until I can figure out where the hell I'm going. So I stopped and noticed that I was going to be running out of food real soon. I did bring extra, knowing that something always could go wrong, but I didn't think I was going to have anything go wrong. Now, here I was. I slept as best as I could and woke up with the sun and started off in an easterly direction. I mean, there had to be a trail out there. But as I had no idea where I was kind of scared. I stayed positive and made my way, but it's hard to shake that feeling when you're not seeing any progress and you feel like you're really lost. I walked and walked again, and still nothing. I came up on a little hill and saw a lake in the distance and figured I would make my way towards the lake, as for whatever reason in my head, I thought that a trail had to go to the lake. Yeah, that's the way I was thinking, not super rational. I made for the lake, and just like anything else and anyone who's been out in the woods or out hiking, everything looks a hell of a lot closer than it really is. I figured I'd be there in an hour or so, but after 2 hours of walking, I still had not found my way to the lake following my compass direction. Night was falling again, and now I knew I was really in trouble. That night I barely slept at all. I'm a grown man, and I'm not going to lie, I was scared to the point of tears. I was frustrated and mad at myself for being an idiot and going off the trail. I finally dozed off and woke up angry. I was not going to sit around feeling sorry for myself. I was going to make this happen and get the hell out of there. Thankfully, after a half day of walking, I did come across a trail. I had no idea where it led, but I was just happy to be on something that was defined. I started walking, hoping to run into someone who could tell me where the hell I was, and thank God that actually happened. A young couple was coming up the trail and saw me and waved. I stopped them and asked what trail I was on, and they told me, then asked if I was okay. They could tell something was wrong. I told them that I had gotten lost and was now trying to figure out how to get back to where my vehicle was. They were really cool, gave me some food that they had, and told me that they had a different map than mine. We looked at it, and I was nowhere near my car. How the hell I got that far away from it, I have no idea. They asked if I would walk with them for a bit in the direction of my car, and I said yes. I needed company at that point. I was over being by myself. We walked along until they were taking a different trail, but now I had an idea of where I was, so that made things a little easier. It did take longer to get to my vehicle, and as a matter of fact, an extra whole day, but I made it to my car, thankful that I did. I didn't realize that my family was at home wondering where the hell I was. All I knew was I was hungry, I was thirsty, and I was miserable. But as I got into my car, I realized something. In the face of adversity, I got out of being lost. I stayed strong and found my way, and I think that was some kind of message or metaphor for where I was in life. Things for me personally were upside down, but I knew at that moment I would get through it, because that's just the way life is. If you work at it, you'll get through it. I left part of me out in that national forest, but I also found a new part of me, one that I had never realized was in me. I'm sure some of your listeners will think this is a cheesy story with a goofy happy ending, but the truth be told, I have never been more scared in my entire life. If you've ever really been lost and you're fighting the feelings that you have when you're out in the middle of nowhere all alone, let me tell you, it's scarier than any horror movie. When your mind wanders and you're thinking, shit, this is it, I'm dead, it's not a fun time. I'll end here. I eventually found another wonderful woman, and we've been happily married for years and have 2 kids. I take them hiking, and we all go camping, and I always remind them to stay on the trail and to never lose your cool if you do get lost. If you are a serious comic book collector, just starting out your collection, or maybe you're just a casual reader, then you have to check out 3D Comics in Lancaster, New York. From graded comics, custom art lithographs, limited edition prints and statues, 3D Comics is a must-see for the serious enthusiast, but the laid-back atmosphere is perfect for anyone with a love for comic books and more. They also specialize in custom art Funko Pops, taking regular Funko Pops and having a team of artists do original art on the boxes. Each comes with a certificate of authenticity. Located at 32 Central Ave in the heart of the village of historic Lancaster, New York, 3D Comics is open Wednesday through Saturday, 10 to 6, with special appointments available on Sundays. Find them online at 3dcomicsandmore.com. That's the number 3, the letter D, comicsandmore.com. And if you prefer to shop online, owner Joel Sharmani has tons of items available on eBay. Find a quick link to that on the shop's homepage. They also feature in-store appearances from today's hottest artists, special offers, and every Wednesday is New Comic Book Day. Give them a call at 716-860-7837, visit them online right now at 3dcomicsandmore.com, or better yet, just stop on in. But no matter where you are around the round world, 3D Comics is your destination for the best in comic books, custom art, and beyond. 3D Comics and More. That's the number 3, the letter D, comicsandmore.com. Tell them Uncle Josh sent you.